At the height of their popularity, the Mega Man games were considered the pinnacle of the platforming genre. Tight platforming, well-thought-out level design, a variety of bosses and stages, challenging difficulty. It was easy to understand why the series was so beloved by fans. However, it's been years since a proper Mega Man game has been released. The last ones were Mega Man 10, which was a return to the classic 8-bit series, and Street Fighter Cross Mega Man, which was a fan-developed game. It appeared like Capcom had lost any interest in creating any new Mega Man games. Hope returned though when on August 31st, 2013, ex-Capcom employee and Mega Man character designer Keiji Inafune created a Kickstarter for Mighty No. 9, a spiritual successor to Mega Man. The internet exploded. Mega Man was coming back. The project reached its goal of $900,000 in just 2 days, and by the end of the 30 days of crowdfunding had earned more than $3.8 million, with the promise of additional content from stretch goals. That's not even including the extra PayPal campaign, which pushed the grand total to $4 million. Everyone was excited about this new return to Mega Man. That is, until problems started to appear. 3 separate delays from the original release date of April 2015, and a second Kickstarter for another Mega Man-inspired game, Red Ash, had many backers and fans on edge, questioning the project. This was all topped off with some poorly done ads prior to release.
Oh, and look at this. There's all these combo moves you can do. Then you can do combos on combos to rack up your score. And I know you like that combo on combo action.
But on June 21st, 2016, Mighty No. 9 was finally released, and it's meh. The overall experience definitely tries to evoke the feeling of Mega Man, but just falls short. The presentation is lacking and the general level design is uninspired. The new dash mechanic, which allows you to absorb weakened enemies, has its merits, but fails to cover the game's many shortcomings. I can't help but see it as a bit of a monkey's paw scenario. Mega Man was revived, but not in the way we wanted. It returned as a soulless husk. It makes you wonder if Capcom has been right for not making any new Mega Man style games. Is it just too outdated? Had the Blue Bomber gone the way of pinball, game manuals, and finished games? That thought process might have been correct if we didn't have Shovel Knight. A Kickstarter game that was released in 2014, Shovel Knight is a homage to the classic NES-style platformers, while still feeling new and refreshing. It takes inspiration from Mega Man while still adding in old and new game mechanics. It's easily one of the best platforming games this generation, or ever really. So what makes Shovel Knight so much more different from Mighty No. 9? They're both send-ups to the classic Mega Man games, but why is one so much better than the other? Well, I'm going to show how Shovel Knight succeeds where Mighty No. 9 fails, both as a Mega Man successor and as a game in general. It is the present year being the first line of Mighty No. 9 says a lot about the effort that went into the story. It's whatever year it is. The reason Mega Man was set in 2000X and 20XX in future games is that it was far enough in the future, at least in the 80s and 90s, that it can be thought of as futuristic, but close enough in time that it was imaginable. While that time seems dated by today's standards, it was an attempt at building an atmosphere. Being told it's the present year doesn't really tell the audience anything. Anyway, if you've played any Mega Man game, you already know what Mighty No. 9's story is about. In a technologically advanced world, a virus has corrupted machines and androids across the country, and it's up to Beck, the 9th Mighty Number, to stop them and save America. Wait, America? The game is set in America. Why? I know this is a pretty minor nitpick right out of the gate, but setting a futuristic story in a modern world seems kind of immersion shattering. If being set in America had some type of importance to the story I could understand, like how Deus Ex Human Revolution looks at how society would be affected by human augmentation, but it doesn't. The only thing that being set in America changes is that the world map uses the standard map of the US. Oh well, guess it's time to save America. So Beck has to fight the other Mighty Numbers in order to help his creator, Dr. White, figure out what kind of virus is infecting all the other robots. And that's about as far as the plot goes, at least where Beck is concerned. While I can understand wanting to keep true to the spirit of the original series, it doesn't do anything to try to innovate or deviate from the classic Mega Man narrative. Sure, there's a subplot about Dr. White being the son of Dr. Blackwell, the assumed villain of the game, and wanting to fix his past mistakes, but it doesn't really change the story as a whole. I'm sure this is supposed to set up a future game plotline, but it just falls flat. The exposition is also clunky and poorly executed.
Beck, did you just absorb the cells of a weakened robot? My goodness, assimilate them? Of course. I designed him with that capability. But I hadn't thought it functional yet. Why now?
Mighty Number 9 struggles to present information without coming off as either ham-fisted or vague. The two doctors continuously talk about Dr. Blackwell, yet we don't meet him until the last third of the game, and even then he's only there to give exposition. And the development with Dr. White is clumsy as well. See, he's named Bill Blackwell but changed it to Will White. He's leaving the darkness and going towards the light. You get it? Mega Man had an excuse for why it didn't have a good story, or any story for that matter, and that was because it was on the NES. Many games on the NES didn't have a complex story because A, the focus at the time was gameplay, and B, the average NES cartridge couldn't hold more than 1 megabyte of data. These two factors meant that the plot of Mega Man 1 was relegated to the game manual, while Mega Man 2 had a little blurb before the start screen. But as the series and technology progressed, the storyline was given more attention. Mega Man X had the same general setup as its predecessors, but added themes of growth and change, especially by having recurring encounters with X's fellow Maverick Hunter Zero. Future Mega Man X games would even raise some very important questions.
What? What am I fighting for?
Shovel Knight has a simplistic story too, going for the same 8 villains running amok for the titular knight to defeat, but there's an underlying theme of loss and regret. The hero goes into retirement from adventuring after losing his partner Shield Knight in the Tower of Fate, but is brought back into it when the Enchantress and the Order of No Quarter take control of the lands. Shovel Knight's remorse in losing Shield Knight in the Tower of Fate is shown in the dream sections after select boss fights, where you must save a falling Shield Knight only for a hero to awaken before he reunites with her. This subtly foreshadows saving her after defeating the Enchantress, and adds a lot to that moment because it's no longer a dream. But it's not just about saving a love interest, it's about saving a partner. Shield Knight isn't simply a damsel in distress. This is really shown during the Remnant of Fate boss fight, where you see how well the two knights' skills complement each other, with Shield Knight blocking energy beams and boosting Shovel Knight so that he can get into position to attack. And in a twist, it's Shield Knight who saves Shovel Knight at the end when the Tower of Fate is falling apart and the Remnant of Fate attacks one last time. Shield Knight asks Black Knight to take her partner away while she protects them both and says how glad she was to see them. In such a short amount of time, you get a good sense of her character and how it fits into the world. Luckily, Shield Knight does make it out in the end, because if she didn't, it would have put Shovel Knight in the same position he was at the start of the game, which would have made the whole adventure kind of pointless. Then there's Black Knight. He is the proto-man to Shovel Knight's Mega Man. Throughout the game, he acts as an antagonist, standing in Shovel Knight's way, until it's revealed in the third act that he was protecting Shield Knight after her evil makeover into the Enchantress. However, as Shovel Knight's equal, he doesn't fall to her spells and keeps his own agency. And even though Black Knight regards Shovel Knight as his rival, he still shows a begrudging respect to him, having faith that he might be able to bring Shield Knight back. It's these subtle character moments that make Shovel Knight's story stand out against Mighty Number 9's. Probably the biggest fault in Mighty Number 9's story when compared to Shovel Knight, though, is that Beck isn't the protagonist of his own story. He's a side character at best. The plot focuses on Will White and his redemption for his past mistakes when making Trinity, and Beck is simply a tool to accomplish this. The game talks about how caring Beck is and that's why he's special, but we never see this in the game. He barely speaks in cutscenes and more often just stands there, staring. This is why Shovel Knight is a more engaging character to play as, because he actually has his own motives and agency beyond simply being the player avatar. The merits of a platformer is based on how well its levels are designed. The Mega Man series has been known for having some of the best level designs, for the most part, due to how the games try to teach everything you need to know through how it places things through a stage. The player is given plenty of time to understand how to approach an enemy or obstacle with the information given through the level design, like the moving platforms in Crash Man's stage that get progressively more complex movement patterns as the player progresses, or how the Top Fiend and Top Man stage is placed at the peak of a large set of stairs when they're first introduced, so that when they start dispensing tops, the player has enough time to figure out what to do before they reach them. In the same way, Mighty Number 9 does try to demonstrate how certain enemies and level gimmicks work by how they're placed in a stage, like having the billboard enemy fly over Beck when it's first introduced in Brandish's stage, but it does a poor job of showing the player vital information, and punishes them for not catching on. For example, in Dina's stage, there's electric turbines that clearly kill you if you touch them. Fortunately, you're presented a clear path around them when they're first introduced. The problem comes when you have to crouch dash underneath one later, because it doesn't really establish how close you have to be to get past it safely. So if you aren't dangerously close, you will probably spend a life learning that you need to be. This is just bad level design because it doesn't feel like the death is earned, since you did what the game wanted, but had no clear indication on the specifics. Punishing the player for not knowing something makes the game feel like it's trial and error. You shouldn't have to learn a lesson at the cost of a life, especially when you have a limited amount. Other examples of this are Pyrogen's powered up one-hit kill state, Countershade's insta-death electric wires, and simply being pushed into spikes by enemies. Say what you will about Dark Souls difficulty, but any death that occurs in the game can easily be attributed to something the player did or didn't do, much like Shovel Knight. Due to how Shovel Knight stages are designed, any death that happens feels like it's your fault. The game does everything it can to show the player what they need to know. Mole Knight's stage has this in spades, like early on demonstrating how lava drips affect goo, or showing how the chain reaction blocks work in a safe area right next to a checkpoint before it becomes a common level hazard. The intro level alone teaches you everything you need to know about gameplay. At the start of the stage, most players will assume all they can do is a shovel strike and a jump, since that's all the regular buttons do. But when the player encounters some destructible blocks that can't be hit by the regular attack, they'll most likely try every combination of buttons, inevitably hitting down while mid-jump, which locks Shovel Knight into a down strike. This will destroy the block and cause Shovel Knight to bounce before coming down onto the next block. So when the player reaches the next area and sees a bubble obstructing a ledge that's too high to jump to, they will conclude that the bounce from the down strike onto the bubble will help them progress. These are skills that are needed throughout the game, and it doesn't even need to stop for a tutorial. The design of the stages also incentivize exploring. Shovel Knight is an adventurer, so thematically this makes sense. This means keeping an eye out for little differences in the level, like cracks and insignias in the walls that can be broken, or seemingly out of reach areas that can be reached by using things around you. These hidden areas that can be found have more difficult platforming but yield bigger rewards, like chests filled with gems. By collecting enough gems, you can buy upgrades for Shovel Knight, like relics with special abilities and health boosts, which in turn can help in our hero's adventure. By giving the player rewards for exploring, it feels really fulfilling when you earn a bunch of gems or find relics, much like when you find armor parts in Mega Man X. You found those and you earned them. Plus there's more incentive to replay stages to see if you missed any secret areas, something Mighty No. 9 sorely lacks. So most people understand what a Mega Man plays like. It's jump and shoot man. You jump to different platforms and shoot the enemies. It's pretty simple, easy to understand gameplay. This is the type of thing Mighty No. 9 tries to emulate, and yeah, there is jumping and shooting, but there's a dissonance with the gameplay and its flow. The game's general design fits somewhere between classic Mega Man and Mega Man X, and that's where the problem lies. To elaborate, you have to understand that Mega Man X changed a lot more about Mega Man than just adding in an extra letter. If you want the full lowdown, check out Egoraptor's sequelitis video on it, but basically it boils down to the speed of the game. Classic Mega Man was about slower, more precise, pixel-perfect platforming through single-screen challenges. Then Mega Man X introduced dashing, wall climbing, and continuous side-scrolling. The addition of faster mobility and no screen transitions meant that the game flowed much faster, and the platforming didn't have to be as precise since you could save yourself through wall climbing. So what does this have to do with Mighty No. 9, you might be asking? Well, Mighty No. 9's classic Mega Man level design clashes with the Mega Man X speed of the game. The game's best when you're constantly dashing through levels, absorbing enemies, but the flow is halted when you come upon slower, precision-based platforming, or an obstacle that you have to wait to move out of the way. This is the problem because the game doesn't have a consistent flow to it. As soon as you're getting into a good rhythm, something slows you down, if not outright stopping you. For example, look at Pyrogen's stage. For a majority of it, you can dash through it without too much trouble, but then there's these rotating fire enemies that block your way. This halts your progress to a standstill until it spins its arms enough to open up the path. These enemies are also positioned out of the way from where your blaster can hit, so you have no option but to wait until you can pass through. This type of thing happens in almost every stage, and it kills the enjoyment of the flow you get from dashing through levels at a good pace. The game's design is even focused on speedruns, which is why there's shortcuts in some of the stages that let you skip past areas, and why you're rewarded for finishing sections quickly. This speedrun design is confusing when the levels need you to carefully maneuver around things that will kill you instantly and make you restart the whole area again. It's like if you were playing a racing game that had you frequently stop for ducks that were crossing the street, or else you had to restart the lap. It's just counterintuitive. Meanwhile, the flow of Shovel Knight's general gameplay is one of its biggest strengths. Shovel Knight himself has a nice Mega Man-like run and jump speed, so you're always moving at a nice consistent pace. Even the bounce from the shovel drop has a good rhythm to it. Being a send-up to retro games, Shovel Knight brings back single-screen rooms and screen transitions, especially when traveling vertically, much like classic Mega Mans. Since you're continuously going through transitions into new areas, means that even if it's your first time playing through a stage, it feels like you're going through at a decent pace, which feels motivating. Also, because you're never put into a situation where you have to wait more than a second or two, there's this constant sense of progression that stays throughout the stage. And any time where you are waiting, it's getting ready to jump into the next platforming section, building up this
Anticipation.
One of the biggest innovations the Mega Man games introduced was the ability for players to choose which stages they want to do first and in whatever order. By doing this, it created a less linear experience than something like Mario. Though while this design does allow the player a lot of freedom in how they want to go through the game, it also means that the stage difficulty has to be consistent throughout, since the player can choose any stage right from the start. The problem with this type of design is that you can't create a steady difficulty curve. Ideally, the game should become progressively more challenging, requiring the player to master the game's mechanics as they advance, as demonstrated by the scientific chart. This is why the difficulty peaks near the later stages of the game, as they're meant to test everything you've learned prior to getting there. But since the Mega Man games allow the player to choose which stages they want to play when, it's kind of hard to have a gradual difficulty curve, since the player can choose one of the harder stages right at the start without knowing it. I know Mega Man has always been known for its tough as nails difficulty, but you need to work up to the hardest points. Start with a little foreplay. This difficulty with difficulty curves has been something Mega Man has struggled with for years, and it's something Mighty No. 9 continues. The difficulty of stages for Mighty No. 9 is inconsistent to say the least. Like, look at Counter Shade's stage. It's a cakewalk since it has no platforming challenges, requiring the player to only avoid the boss's gunfire and, later on, the electric wires, while dealing with the occasional enemy robot. Seismic's stage, on the other hand, requires precise platforming and dashing to make it through all the death spikes, making it a much harder stage. Now you could do Counter Shade's stage earlier and wait to go through Seismic's later on, though this isn't something you'd be inclined to do during your first playthrough. Plus, the boss order where you use the previous boss's skill to exploit the next weakness has you facing Seismic before Counter Shade, especially since Pyrogen is probably where most players will start off, because he's the easiest boss to deal with using just the regular blaster. This boss order means that players will likely go through the more difficult stages like Seismic and Battalions during the mid-game, and facing the simpler stages at the end, namely Counter Shade and Avies. You could argue that this might make the player feel like they're mastering the game, giving them a sense of empowerment, but the final stages after the first 8 are much more challenging, so it just screws up the build-up to that. Shovel Knight keeps the choices of stages too, but made one modification to allow for better difficulty progression, and that was by limiting the stage choices to 2 or 3 at a time. It might seem like a small modification, but it drastically changes how the player goes through the game. At the start, after completing the intro level, you can only do King Knight or Spectre Knight stages. Both of these help establish the typical enemy patterns and up the challenge of platforming that was seen in the intro stage, like bouncing off multiple enemies and dealing with different stage gimmicks. After completing those stages, the world opens up more and unlocks Plague Knight, Mole Knight, and Treasure Knight, whose stages are more challenging. These introduce tougher challenges like scrolling boss fights and exploding platforms. With this type of progression, you feel prepared when you reach a new challenge, and when you arrive at the last stages and have to put everything you've done to use, which is the ideal difficulty curve. The live systems in video games are from a bygone era, where games were played on coin-op arcade machines. By making these games more difficult and having a game over state, the player would be more inclined to put more money in so that they could continue playing, meaning more money for the developers. Mega Man was created during the transition of video games from arcades to home consoles, and the live system was just something that happened to come along for the ride. Having lives as a key mechanic was also used to artificially lengthen the time it took to complete the game, because games that were over too quickly weren't considered a good investment. Majority of modern games have evolved past this though, using autosaves and regular checkpoints to allow players to get right back into the game after they die. Except nobody told this to the developers of Mighty No. 9. Frustratingly, Mighty No. 9 brings the live system back, which is probably one of the most aggravating aspects of the game. Getting through a stage with one last life and arriving at the boss, only to die and have to restart the entire process again, made me close the game more than once. This is something the developers must have known would be a problem, since you can change the standard amount of lives in the options menu. But that begs the question of, why keep it in? Having to restart a level that you've already done only to get back to the place you were isn't enjoyable. Dying and having to go back to a checkpoint is already enough of a drawback, so there's no need for a live system on top of this that requires you to restart from the very beginning. The developers might as well have just gotten rid of the live systems. Or did something like Shovel Knight did. Shovel Knight revamps the live system difficulty drastically in two ways. First, there's usually 4 or 5 checkpoints per level that Shovel Knight respawns at after death. But if the player wishes, they can destroy checkpoints for gems, at the cost of them no longer being usable. This creates a risk-reward system where the player must question whether they think they can get to the next checkpoint without dying, and if it's worth the risk in destroying the checkpoint they're currently at. The checkpoints are also colored differently to indicate how challenging the next section will be, and that this checkpoint will reward more gems because of this. The second way that Shovel Knight evolves the live system difficulty is by taking direct inspiration from Dark Souls. When Shovel Knight dies, the player does not lose a life. Instead, they lose a portion of their gems, which are left where Shovel Knight fell. If the player wants to get these gems back, they have to return to where they died and pick them up. If the player dies again getting back to those gems, they not only lose another portion of gems, but the previous batch is gone for good. This too adds a risk-reward system because not only do you have to worry about making it back to that same place, but if the gems are placed in a difficult-to-reach area, you have to choose whether it's worth trying to get them back at the risk of dying again and losing more gems. By getting rid of a live system and implementing these changes, Shovel Knight removes the frustration of losing a life, but retains the risk of it. I could go on, but I've already been rambling for 23 minutes? Jeez, thanks for listening to all that, if you're still here. There's a lot more reasons on why I think Shovel Knight's better design than Mighty No. 9, but the main factor can be boiled down to the fact that Mighty No. 9 isn't all that fun. And it's disappointing that it came out so lackluster because it does have potential. The creators understood what people loved about Mega Man, but didn't know what they needed to do to bring it into the modern age. Mighty No. 9 may be an accurate representation of classic Mega Man, but refuses to fix game design problems that have been solved years ago, out of the belief that it's what made Mega Man a classic. Hopefully, if the game gets a sequel, the next entry will improve on the failings of this entry. But until then, you can find me stealing my shovel with Shovel Knight.